I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Yuggera land, on which I am recording this presentation today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge that this land, which we benefit from occupying, was stolen, and that sovereignty was never ceded by the Yuggera people. We all age. Some of us age more gracefully than others. Our documentation ages too, and sadly, it's not always glamorous. Docs that start out as a thing of elegance and beauty can, many years and patches later, become tired, sad, and badly in need of retirement. Sometimes the content is so out of date and so incorrect, and the format so anachronistic that it just needs to be consigned to a recycling bin. But not all documentation should be euthanized. Sometimes it just needs a facelift. This talk is about a few things. It's about agile documentation, managing large docs projects, and about stakeholder engagement and quality assurance. But mostly, it's about what to do when you realize you have a whole lot of work ahead of you. I work for an open source software company called SUSE. I started there just over 2 years ago, and like most people when they start a new job, the first thing I needed to do was get a lay of the land. The documentation suite I was faced with is pretty huge. It has nearly 30,000 lines of ASCII doc, broken up into 10 different books, or about 23 megabytes of PDF files. The longest book is 148 pages, the shortest, just 17. Last month, we merged 60 pull requests to our Git repository, containing 170 commits to the master branch. The number of writers we have to manage this monster? 3, including me. Luckily, the content that existed when I joined was actually pretty good. It had been lovingly maintained by an interested group of engineers and 2 technical writers for some time. The main problem was that there was no one working on the docs who had a background in information architecture. The suite had gotten a structure reorganization about 3 years ago when it was converted to ASCII doc from DocBook XML. And while they meant well and had the best intentions, it sort of wound up still badly organized, but differently. To start with, I want to discuss what I mean when I say agile documentation. At its heart, whether you're writing software or documentation, agile development is about rapid iterations. Each iteration is supposed to end with a minimum viable product. So the first iteration will be terrible, but it works in a very basic sense. The second iteration will work a little bit better, and you keep going until you have a finished, polished product. The point of this is that you can gather feedback from people as you go and incorporate their ideas into the design. Ideally, you end up with a better finished product in the same period of time, because the planning and feedback stages occurred during development rather than in chunks before and after. When I was a baby technical writer, back in the dim, dark ages of waterfall development, it was just kind of accepted that you couldn't write documentation using these newfangled agile things that the software developers were excited about. Now, of course, thanks to the hard work by people like Anne Gentle, we have docs as code. And we know that not only is it possible to produce documentation that way, but in many cases it actually produces better documentation. Because we are working with software developers at an earlier stage in the process and performing much faster and more efficient editing passes, we end up with better quality documentation that is ready to publish as soon as the feature itself goes live. So we no longer have these delays between the code being ready and the docs being ready. Technical writers do more than just write docs for features and bug fixes, though. And this is where we can find that the model breaks down a bit. To give you some context, the team I'm working on is an Agile team, and they care deeply about ensuring our Agile practices are working effectively. And while I have been and still am a big advocate of Agile documentation, I was instantly faced with a dilemma. This was a big documentation suite that required big structural changes. I didn't need to get feedback as I was going because it was, at its heart, a structural change, not a content change. The content was good. It was just in the wrong place. I really needed to spend time on planning the structure we wanted, mapping the old content into the new structure, and then shifting every piece of content into its rightful new home. Of course, we needed to do other things as well. We needed to do some edits for consistency and that kind of thing. But that could all be done once the content had been moved to the right place. And I just couldn't see a way to make that happen within 2-week sprints. In order to do the kind of big changes I wanted to do, and to be able to do it in a way that almost broke our entire engineering model, I was going to need buy-in, not just from my small documentation team, but also the engineering team and a range of different layers of management. To do this, I was going to need a solid plan based on good research and best practices, and I was going to need to work hard to get engagement and buy-in at every step along the way. So here's how I tackled it. First, do a proof of concept. This is important to get the lay of the land, but also to start building engagement with other teams. Luckily for me, SUSE has a week every year called Hack Week, where engineering staff get to work on passion projects. These can be personal projects like learning a language or an instrument, but a lot of people like to use Hack Week to work on those things we don't get time to do in our general day-to-day work, and they're often used to improve our infrastructure and make our day jobs easier. So I used my Hack Week to perform a really rough review of the existing content. I went back to basics. I printed out the tables of contents of each book and highlighted each section in different colours for different topic types, concepts, tasks, and reference. Ideally, an exercise like this would leave you with blocks of colour in a predictable order, but mine looked like a mess. This gave me a great visual to explain the problem to the rest of the team. From there, I could identify the key areas that needed work and sketch out a very rough idea of what an updated structure could look like. By the end, I was able to present something quite substantial to the rest of the team. I could describe the problem and propose a solution. This was the very first step to being able to get buy-in from the various teams. Once I had the docs team on board with the idea, I took it to various other people to get them on board with the idea. Those conversations helped me to lay out roughly how long we needed to do the work, and it gave the various stakeholders an early chance to shape the project in a way that suited them. In the end, this gave me a sense of tacit approval to start planning the real thing. And with a project the size and complexity of what we needed to do, having that early acceptance was really important. Second up, plan, plan, plan. Once you have engagement and you're hearing positive noises from people in power, go ahead and structure your project timeline. It helps if you can have a big deadline to aim for, and in our case, we had a major product release coming up in a little over 12 months, so it made sense to aim for that. I planned the project using the Joanne Hayco's 5-phase model, which gives a nice structure for a big project like this, but is also flexible enough that it can be easily adjusted to suit your circumstances. The 5 phases are information plan, content specification, development, production, and review. This structure is something I'd already used within the team on a much smaller scale, so it had the benefit of being somewhat familiar to everyone. The other added bonus of using an accepted model like HACOS is that you can encourage people to read the book. Even if no one actually reads it, the fact that you recommend one makes it seem as though you're doing something totally legit. Those who know me know that I have a habit of holding up books in meetings to back up my assertions, and this is definitely one of my favourite books to do this with. When you have the structure for your projects set out, you can set your dates and advertise them. I like to make a point of doing at least one presentation to the team for each phase, to explain what's going on in this phase, where it fits in the grand scheme of the project, and the kinds of things people can expect to see the docs team doing at the moment. If your Agile team has a sprint review meeting where you're encouraged to present on your work, this is an ideal place to do those kinds of presentations. And it really helps to keep you and your project top of mind, especially during a really long project timeline like ours was. It's really important, even if it is your natural inclination, to not just hide away and do the work quietly. You also need to make sure you keep engagement up all the way through. Third is research. Get in contact with your readers in any way you can. But remember that your readers are not always, or sometimes not even mostly, your customers. Depending on your product, you may find that sales and support staff use your docs more than your customers do. We did a series of one-on-one interviews with sales and consulting staff, and then we sent a 7-question survey to a number of company mailing lists for internal staff to complete, and we requested that they send them on to their customers where it was appropriate. This mechanism served a few purposes. First of all, it got us direct feedback on our current docs from the people who are actually reading them. Secondly, it also got a larger group of people interested in and knowing that there's someone who cares about this documentation. On the first point, we had a lot of our suspicions confirmed about the pain points, which is great, because now we had the data to back up why we were making the changes we were. On the second point, you might not get any advantage immediately, but in the weeks and months to come, when someone notices a problem with the doc, they're much more likely to go, hold on, someone was asking about this recently. Who was that? So it actually builds engagement in the really long term as well. It's also really important to understand what your readers actually want, rather than what you think they might want. Our developers kept telling us that we needed more quick start information, but when we asked our readers, they all said they wanted more explanations of how things worked and not just step-by-step procedures. So both of those are about getting started, sure, but in terms of content types, they're very different. By the same token, you also need to find out if readers actually want what they say they want. One piece of feedback we got from a reader was to stop moving things around. This was really interesting because when we dug deeper into the problem, it turned out that people found the documentation so difficult to navigate that they were saving hard links to the content they needed, and so when we moved things, those links broke. The problem was not that we were moving things around, but that they couldn't find stuff in the first place. In the end, what we did was improve the navigability of the site, implement a really good site search mechanism, and also got more consistency in our section headings and procedure titles, so it was clearer what was in each section and where you were within them. So for example, now we always use a noun form for the main concept, like the feature, the verb form for the description of a task, like install the feature, and then we use the gerund form for the procedure itself, so it would be installing the feature. That consistency helps place people within the content. The fourth thing is to do a user task analysis. Now, a user task analysis can probably be considered part of the research step, but I think it's important enough to break it out to its own point. It also takes a little more explanation if you've never done one before, so I wanted to spend a little bit more time on it. When you've completed your reader surveys, you should have a pretty good idea of your top 3 to 5 main reader types. You don't need to list out every single reader type, but you should be able to group most of them into some broad categories that cover the spectrum of your readers. We selected system admin, sales, and support, but we could have easily included developers, hobbyists, executives, or any number of others. So once you've done that, you can pick out some of the main tasks that people use the docs to do. Things like installing the product, using the main features, doing administration tasks like setting preferences and configuring the product, and upgrading and uninstalling. So once you have those things, you can put them in a little table like this and work out how likely it is that a particular reader will use the documentation to do each task. If you put the reader types across the top of your table and all of the tasks down the side, you get a great matrix that looks something like this. Obviously, this is only a small one, but it should give you the idea. You can fill out each square on the table with the likelihood that each reader type will use the docs to do each task. Now, note the really important thing here. You're not asking if system administrators are more likely to do a product installation, because of course they're likely to do a product installation. What you're asking is, are system admins likely to use the documentation to do a product installation? The answer to that is trickier, and it depends on how easy your product is to install and how familiar a system admin might be with the task. When you have all the boxes filled out, you can do some simple maths and score a 3 for high likelihood, 2 for medium, and 1 for low. That gives each task a score. The higher the number, the more critical the documentation for this task is. So in the example here, you can see that product research scores a 6 because it's only really important to one group. But managing clients scores a 9 because it's important to everyone. That means we know we need to spend more time and effort on documenting how to manage clients, and we can improve the general product information later on. Of course, all of this doesn't mean that the lower ranked things aren't important. It just helps you to know where to focus. If you find that your focus points are not adequately covered in your existing docs, then you have an immediate start point. 5th, do the thing. Actually do it. Whatever it is, go and do it. One of the most important things during this phase is to track your work. In our case, we were moving from long files for each chapter to smaller files for each section. And we had 3 people working in 2 time zones working on it. So just tracking that work was a big exercise. Of course, how you do that is entirely up to you, your environment, and the people you work with. But whatever you choose, make sure you've discussed it ahead of time and have a plan in place before you begin. You also need to make sure you have buy-in from that plan, from the people who actually have to use it. Now, there's 2 levels to tracking this work. First of all is the real tracking, the thing that you need everyone to check in with at least once a day, to know which piece of work to pick up next and to record what's done and what isn't. For us, this was a simple spreadsheet on Google Docs that had a list of files that needed to be moved with the place they needed to move to. You put your name against the file, did what needed to be done, and then ticked it off when it was complete. It stopped multiple people working on the same files by accident and meant that we all had really good situational awareness of how far through we were and how much we still had to go. It also meant I had good statistics for reporting back to management, because at any time I could say, oh yes, we've completed books 1 and 2 and we're halfway through 3. And that was measurable against the timelines that we had set for ourselves. The second type of tracking is how you track this within your Agile project management ecosystem. If your ecosystem uses epics, then mark it as an epic and sketch out each of the phases I mentioned above as a task. Depending on the length of your sprints and the amount of time you have scheduled for your project, You might even need to have an epic for each of those tasks. Avoid the trap of trying to track everything you are doing though, or you'll spend all your time creating user stories and moving tasks and epics around a board and not actually doing what you need to be doing. This is why the outreach is so important. You need to account for the time you're spending within your Agile ecosystem, but your team need to be aware that this is a special project which is sitting outside the scope of the usual user stories. It's just there so that people don't forget about it. And number 6, finally, review, review, review. This step is probably the simplest, but I would argue that it's the second most important thing after planning. It doesn't need to be a lengthy process or even a particularly formal process, but at some point you need an airing of grievances. My one tip here is to ensure you focus on the problem, not the people. You can use what the psychologists call I statements, and that's the best way to handle it. Don't say things like, Janet wouldn't give me the information I needed. Say, I found it difficult to get the information I needed. That way you get closer to identifying the real problem and you don't make Janet feel like an arse. When you phrase things in this way, it helps you to uncover the structural reasons why problems arise, rather than just putting the blame on people. Having said that, if Janet actually is an arse, you can still do something about it, but make it a private conversation with Janet or her manager, not out in public in a review meeting. The format I like best for these kinds of review meetings is pretty simple. Start with things that went well, so you get the feel-good hit right up front. Go into things that didn't go so well in the middle. This is where the I statements are important. So remind people of that before you start, especially if you think it's going to get ugly. If you're worried it's going to turn into a giant bitch session, make sure you put a time box on it and really stick to it. Always encourage people to take things to email if they need to continue, because it can take the heat out of the argument. Finally, finish up with things we would like to do better next time, so you can wrap up on a note of positivity and hope for a much better project the next time. So make sure you record dot points for each of them, and then send them out to the group for feedback and conversation on email as well. And remember to implement the recommendations. It's no good doing these things if nothing ever changes. So this is very clearly not an agile process. It is, in fact, a very, dare I say it, waterfall-y process. As much as it pains me to say it, there are some kinds of work that just do not lend themselves well to rapid iteration. If you go back to the original Agile Manifesto, it talks about continuous attention to technical excellence. And I think that could be where the problem lies. If you take your eye off the ball of technical excellence within an Agile environment, you end up with what developers refer to as technical debt. The way I like to think about technical debt is what my mum used to say when I was a kid. A stitch in time saves 9. If you do the quick fix now, what's the big fix that you're going to have to deal with a month or a year from now? In documentation terms, technical debt usually accrues in 2 main ways. Either we don't document a topic fully in the first place, or we just put stuff in an acceptable place in the documentation, rather than rearranging things to find the best place. So they're usually related either to content or to structure. The content ones can usually be handled easily, and we have a lot of mechanisms in Agile documentation to do this. We have different review and editing levels. We have simple ways for readers to report typos and fix errors. We even have automated grammar and style linters to help. The structural ones are not so easy to fix once they've taken hold. And preventing them from taking hold in the first place requires not just understanding good content design, but also being empowered to make bigger changes like creating new chapters or moving content around as you go. This is doubly difficult when you have readers saying things like, "Please don't move content around, it breaks my links." The point is that if we all did Agile perfectly, then we wouldn't have to deal with these structural kinds of technical debt. And if you ever work out how to live in that perfect world, then I'd love to come and join you there. Back here where I live, though, it just doesn't happen that way. The constant hamster wheel of 2-week sprints means that things get left half-finished. The new chapter design remains unwritten. That terrible definition list that you really must turn into a proper table will still be a terrible definition list by the time release day arrives. And when all those things pile up so high you can no longer see over them, it's time to open a can of Marie Kondo and work out which bits actually spark joy. I have 2 big tips for you to remember if you're considering this kind of big project. The first is to do your research. You really do not want to get to the end of this and realize that you did it all wrong. Even if you don't manage to deliver exactly what your readers have asked for, at least you will have gone through the process of finding out what they wanted and made calculations about what you could and couldn't do. So later on, when your readers ask why something is the way it is, you can tell them exactly why. Either because you have the original data from readers asking for it, you didn't have anyone ask for it, or because you considered doing it and didn't, for a very good reason, either business or technical. One thing I've done a lot of since this project was complete is to remind people that yes, this was a big, visible change, but it was actually just the first really big step on a much longer journey. We now have a solid structure that will take us forward to a much better documentation suite overall. That helps people to know that their feedback is still being heard and that more improvements are still to come. The second thing I want to emphasize is about outreach. If you're talking to your product owner about what you're doing, and perhaps more importantly, why you're doing it this way, then hopefully you'll be on firm footing. If you can, start with your product owner first, or whoever is at the top of the food chain for you, before you even begin. Give them a heads up that you need to make some fundamental changes, make sure they factor it into their scheduling, and make sure you have their support. Then, keep talking to people. Your outreach to your team should never stop, even after the project is complete. If you have a sprint review session where you can give presentations, make sure you take advantage of them and give regular updates on what you're doing and why you're doing them. If you don't have that opportunity, then grab every chance you have to talk about what you're doing. Whether it's holding a lunchtime brown bag session, grabbing a slot in a planning meeting, or running a regular drop-in or open office session. If all else fails, my trick is to talk too long in stand-up meetings until someone offers you a better outlet. It never fails. To conclude, while I am absolutely in favour of agile development, it's also important to recognise that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, especially for documentation. Don't be afraid to break out of the agile mould if that's what your project requires.
All right, Lana, thanks for joining us for a bit of Q&A action after your excellent talk today.
Thank you.
It was really good to see how you can balance agile and actually still get docs outcomes at the end of it, providing you just use a little bit of, you can, I guess, you sell it a different way to people in organizations that could just be a little bit more resistant to the whole idea of rapid or iterative delivery of docs. Yeah, no, it's definitely a thing. It certainly resonated with me. I mean, I work in a very similar way at the moment where we do just enough docs, we release it, we get feedback, we repeat. And once you get used to doing it, it's great. But doing it first, without having ever done it before, really does feel a bit scary, doesn't it? Can you remember the first time you sort of went into the whole agile way of doing documentation and what that felt like for you?
Oh, yeah. I think I mentioned in the talk about being a baby technical writer. And I can remember having conversations as developers, some pockets of developers were starting to do Agile. And I was having these conversations with the older tech writers around me. And go, oh, well, it's never going to work for documentation, because we still had this idea of narrative forms, and we had to, lock ourselves away in a garret and write our documentation from beginning to end. And the idea that all of a sudden we had to try and modularize stuff and work on it iteratively, and also to work more closely with developers. We hadn't worked that closely with developers before. We'd gone and written all this documentation and then come back and presented it to the developers and said, is this correct? Can you help me improve? Now we had to show developers our very, very early drafts and get them to get feedback really early on. And so the interaction with SMEs became more important, and our management of SMEs became more important, like the previous talk. So yeah, the idea of getting into Agile in the first place is fine, but then now we've sort of almost come full circle. We've gotten to this point where we maintain our documentation in using Agile principles, which works and is great, but then other things start to slide. Those big structural changes that we're not as good at managing in an Agile situation is now what's starting to slide, and we're having to come up with new ways to manage that.
Yeah, that's really, it is hard when you're doing a massive structural change, because you know, you scratch the surface and then you find another bit that comes undone and another bit that comes undone. You have to just keep on patching them up. Yes. Sometimes that's really hard to do within the context of a sprint, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's the point I was trying to make with going back to the Agile Manifesto, is they talk about quality, and you've got to have that quality in first, and that's great, but it doesn't always happen. And especially with documentation, sometimes you can't spot those quality issues and those structural issues until afterwards as well, when they become a real problem, and all of a sudden you go, this isn't working anymore.
Yeah, sometimes you have to suck it and see, don't you? And just
Absolutely.
give it a go. Yeah. Look, we do have a few questions coming in now, which is good. So one of them was a question about running retros. I know you covered that in a fair bit of detail in your presentation, but have you found that there's ways of running these that tend to work better than others? Like, I'm talking more about, you know, different tools that you might want to use, say, you know, Jamboard or something else like that, Mural, for example. Have you found one that sort of works best for you?
I go low tech on this one. I literally do just schedule an hour-long meeting. We have 3 agenda items, which are the ones I went through in the talk. So things that went well, things that didn't go so well, and what can we do better next time? They are literally the only 3 agenda items. Don't let anything else creep in there. I write notes. I send out the notes on email afterwards. I let it be discussed for a week or so, put a hard deadline on it. And then, of course, those become issues for our planning for the next release. So everything goes back in. They go back into our board. They become part of our backlog, and we make sure that we improve on them next time. So there is very much that feedback loop. So they have to come back. If you're not acting on things, no one will attend your retro, and there's no point doing it. But once you've got that feedback, once you've got that information, capture it, make sure you're acting on it. That would be the main thing. As for tools for running the retro, no, I do it old school. I'm an old school tech writer. What can I say?
Keep it easy, keep it low tech. I like it. Hey, I've got a question here, which the person asking this one admittedly said it was covered a little bit in the talk, but they were curious about how you initially determined that the structure of your documentation had gotten a little bit, you know, to the point where it needed to be restructured. Were there some specific signs or things that were sort of standing out for you, or did you sort of just use your gut feel and sort of more data-driven approach to it?
In this particular project, it was easy for me because I was new to the project. I just started with the company. I walked in and I just went, oh no. It was just obvious from the very beginning. It had been unloved for a long time. It is a little more difficult when it's your own baby and you've been working on that thing for a long time and you're so deep in the forest you can't see the trees anymore. That is a very different story, and that's where your information architecture comes in, and also where your reader analysis comes in. I do try to make sure that we're surveying our readers twice a year. I use the same 6-question survey, I think, every single time, and send it out, and we can map trends over that time. But yeah, you sort of got to fall back to first principles at some point there and say, no, this structure just isn't working. Either we're getting feedback that says it's not working, we can see it because we're trained professionals, and it's hard to deal with, it's hard to find things. If we're struggling, our readers will be struggling. Or, you know, you're getting some kind of idea just through trying to use the docs yourself.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely fair enough. Another question here.
coming into
Definitely, there's a definite trend in information architecture in your talks there, Lana. Do you have formal training in IA or information architecture?
Not in IA specifically. I do have a technical communications degree, and of course, IA forms part of that. Gosh, that sounds terrible. Most of my degrees are actually business degrees, and I think part of that, the thought process, the way you learn to think through business problems are and marketing problems, that kind of thing, are often very structure related, put it that way. So in terms of telling a story, being able to get a message across, all those things is things I have learned at a tertiary level, but also just having been a tech writer, it's something that you learn along the way as well. So some formal training in some sense, I guess.
Sorry to interject. I was going to say, and also finding the right resources that teach you more about it, like the book you mentioned.
Absolutely. I went and got it off my shelf for you just so I can do this. This is a very old book, and I do believe it's not in print anymore. When she did you can see all my notes. Yes. When she did the second edition of this, she actually named the book something else. So finding the first edition is actually quite difficult, but it's the first edition that has the 5 phases. If people do want more information on that, there's a bunch of stuff on my website. I've given talks on it in the past. I'm sure you will be able to find that information, or just hit me up on Twitter and I'll.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, another question here is, what were the 6 questions you asked in your reader survey?
Oh gosh, I'd have to pull them up. I'd have to pull them up and have a look. We do an NPS, so your standard Net Promoter Score. Would you recommend the documentation to others? If why not? What is your role in the organization? How important is the documentation? What do you think the documentation does well? What do you think it does poorly? NPS, and then any other comments. I think we've really only got 2 freeform fields, because if you give people too many freeform fields, they won't answer them. But the freeform fields is where you get the really interesting information. That's where we got the information, like I used in the talk, the example of the person saying, please don't move things around. And when we actually tried to dig down into that, it was just because they're using hard links because they couldn't find things. So it's really important to take a look at that feedback and really drill down into what it is that they want rather than what they say they want. It's not always the same thing.
Well, they call it, I think they call it the 5 whys, don't they? Keep asking the 5 whys until you get to the answer.
Yes, absolutely. I also like to marry the survey with in-person interviews or over-the-phone interviews with our consultants and sales staff as well. One thing I discovered, and I can't remember if I mentioned this in the talk or not now, was that the main readers of our documentation were actually not end users a lot of the time, because it's a highly technical product. It's actually sales and consultant staff. And so they're actually our main readers, and we had to shift our thinking a little bit. It's not always the people who are handing us money who are the people who are handing our company money, the people who are reading our docs the most. They use it too, but they're not necessarily our primary audience. So we actually went to our consultants and sales staff. We give them the survey and ask them to pass it on. And I do one-on-one interviews with them as regularly as I can.
That's awesome. Wow, that was a very quick 10 minutes, but we're already out of time.
Oh, gosh. Oh, real quick, the poster behind me is from the oatmeal. It's called How to Use a Semicolon. And I have more on the other wall that you can't see, but oatmeal has a lot of them. Yes, including the a lot, which you can the a lot is actually on top of that bookshelf, but you can't quite see it, I'm afraid.
I love the a lot. For more information about the a lot and all other things,
hyperbole and half.
Yeah, go and chat to Lana in the hallway tracks if you get a chance. But
for now,
it is time to head on over to the main stage again, where we're getting ready to hear from Michael Belton. So get on over there and get ready for the next talk. Thanks again, Lana.
See ya.